Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you have ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. I am your host, Patty Porter. My guest hosts, Dina Zametta and Stephen Kotev, along with our guest experts, will share our experiences, raise your awareness, and give you food for thought. We will share with you problem-solving strategies no matter what your situation is. At work, with neighbors or friends, family, and as partners. Tune in or join in the conversation every Tuesday evening.
Hello, I'm your guest host, Abigail Clark. My co-host is Stephen Kotev, and joining us tonight for our program entitled The UnSlut Project, Stop Slut Shaming and Sexual Bullying, is Emily Lindin. Emily Lindin is the founder of the UnSlut Project, an online community where survivors of sexual bullying and slut shaming can share their stories and where girls who are currently suffering can find support. The UnSlut Project was inspired by Emily's own experience. When she was 11 years old, she was branded a slut by her classmates and was bullied at school, after school, and online. During all this, she kept a regular diary. Now, a Harvard graduate pursuing her PhD in California, Emily started the UnSlut Project by blogging her own middle school diaries. The UnSlut Project crowdfunded film Slut, a documentary film, is in post-production, and Emily's book UnSlut, a Diary and A Memoir, will be published in December 2015. Emily has been featured sharing her story and speaking out against slut shaming on ABC with Katie Couric, CNN with Brooke Baldwin, The Doctors, Al Jazeera America, HLN, DNTO Radio with Sue Zian Lee, NPR with Lance Orzuko and of KCLU, Deutsche Welle Radio, Radio Ireland, and in many magazines and blogs, including The Telegraph, The New Statesman, This Magazine, The Huffington Post, and The Observer. We have our chat room open at blogtalkradio.com/Texas-conflict-coach and are tweeting live using hashtag TCCRadio. We would love for you to join us in these venues with your questions. Welcome to the program, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
So to get started, Emily, what motivated you to start the UnSlut Project?
Well, I had heard about girls who were taking their own lives because they had been labeled a slut at school. First off, for listeners who aren't familiar with the term slut shaming, I use it when we're talking about school interchangeably with sexual bullying because I think it makes it a little easier to understand. Basically, it's just implying that a girl should feel inferior or guilty for what's perceived as her sexual behavior. So often girls who are labeled a slut aren't actually sexually active, just for whatever reason. Sometimes it's through absolutely no fault of their own or nothing they've ever done. They have this label applied to them by their classmates, and then it's so overwhelmingly isolating and shameful for them that they often turn to self-harm, or in these stories I was hearing about suicide. Some of the headlines mentioned a girl named Rotea Parsons who committed suicide in Nova Scotia at the age of 17, and that was back in 2013. And her story was kind of the last straw. It was April of 2013, and I decided that since I could relate to what girls like this were going through, considering suicide because you just feel like there's nowhere to turn when you're being sexually bullied in this way, I realized, I could relate to this, and it's not a rare experience. But what is rare is that I had kept really detailed diaries when I was going through this back in the late 90s, starting from age 11, when my classmates labeled me a slut, originally just because I had breasts when none of the other girls seemed to be developing yet. And I decided to put those diary entries up online just as kind of a quirky blog, a way to join the conversation that was starting about slut shaming, mostly in the feminist blogosphere at that time, although now it's much more mainstream. And once I did that, once I put my story up online and the words I had written when I was a middle school girl suffering in this way, it was like an invitation, and unsolicited, I just started receiving submissions from women who had survived something similar. And sometimes these women were in their 50s or 60s, and they had never spoken to anyone about what they had gone through decades earlier. So it was just a relief for them to be able to share their story. And I thought, oh, there's really something to that, to this personal story sharing as a way to first invite other people to speak up about their experiences, but beyond that, to, and most importantly and immediately, to reach girls who feel that they're completely alone and that they have no friends. Maybe they feel they can't confide in their parents about what they're going through, and they're thinking about self-harm and, in the worst case scenarios, even suicide. Just to have a space online where they can read the stories of women who have survived something similar from all walks of life and all over the world. And maybe there will be something they can relate to specifically, but at the very least, they can get this sense that, many of us have been labeled a slut by our classmates. Many of us have had rumors spread about us. Sometimes we've had, sexual experiences blown out of proportion and turned into something negative, and that makes us feel like we're dirty or immoral, that type of thing. And so just knowing that other women have survived can be the best thing for girls who feel like there's no way for them to survive.
Oh, absolutely. And I've heard this story going through middle school, and myself, I've heard this told countless times where girls are labeled sluts and haven't actually been sexually active at all. So I definitely think it's an awesome thing, and definitely the personal stories really does engage people, and people can feel a sense of camaraderie and all of that as well. And I know you were mentioning that it was girls feeling this. Does it just happen to girls, or is it boys and girls by slut shaming?
Well, it's a good question. Boys are affected by sexual shame, certainly. Often in middle school and high school, it's kind of the reverse. Boys who feel like they don't have enough sexual experience feel inadequate or like there's something wrong with them, versus girls often it operates the other way, although girls can be virgin shamed, made fun of because they're not sexually active as well. And I think the difference between boys who experience it and girls who experience it is that when boys experience sexual shame, it's or men, or even grown men who carry shame with them, it's on an individual basis. Whereas when girls and women experience it, it's part of this larger historical and really institutionalized sexual shaming of girls and women that used to be rooted in economics, when women were traded as wives from their, when they were literally owned by their husbands or fathers. But nowadays, that's no longer the case. But the idea that any kind of sexual activity or enjoying sexual activity or even being rumored to have enjoyed sexual activity at some point in your life is this deeply shameful and kind of devastating reputation for a woman to have, that has lingered for some reason. And it doesn't really make sense nowadays that slut should still make sense even as an insult and everything that it represents, but it does. And we all kind of participate in this culture that allows it to continue.
Well, and it's really interesting because a lot of this sounds like it's just a way of having control over someone. And if you go and say something about, in this case, a girl, it could be a boy, but mostly it's a girl, and you're saying something about them that somehow or another inherently is being used to control them, oh, you're a slut, or, you act like one, or you look like one, or you dress like one, or whatever. It may not actually be true, but it could be a way of taking somebody down, destroying their self-esteem or hurting their self-esteem, or like a way of just sort of trying to make them do something or act a certain way from the person who's doing the shaming. That seems to be really central to this, Emily. Is that right?
Yes, it's definitely about control, and it's a really common way for kids to bully each other, something having to do with sexuality. But it's not just made up out of thin air. And this is true for all kinds of bullying, but sexual bullying in particular, I find it's easy to kind of say, oh, kids are terrible to each other. And that has nothing to do with us as adults. But as parents and educators, we teach our kids how to behave. We model behavior for them. And so when our kids witness us implying that a woman should be ashamed for the way she dresses, or that a rape victim was asking for it because she was flirting with her attacker beforehand. All of these different variations of slut shaming, kids pick up on that, and then they turn around and use it against each other. So I do think it's about control, and it's also just a really common way for kids to fit in by putting someone else down. And a really quick way to do that is for a girl anyway, is to call her a slut, because everyone knows whatever slut means to them, nobody wants to be that, and nobody wants to be associated with that. And so when girls do it to each other, it's often a way to deflect attention, to say, look over there at her, she's a slut. As long as the attention is over there, we're safe for now. Nobody's looking at us. We're not at risk for the moment of being sexually bullied ourselves. So that's a part of it too.
Do you find that it's more girls doing it to other girls, or do you find that like in the stories that you've heard, is it more girl on girl aggression of slut shaming, or is it guys saying it about girls, or is it kind of a mixture?
It's definitely a mixture, and it's for different reasons. The girls who slut shame other girls, I was just describing a situation in which, in order to deflect attention away from ourselves, because we know that we are always at risk. When boys do slut shame girls, I find it's more a knee-jerk reaction because they have this sense that a sexual girl is somehow bad and gross. They've learned that and absorbed that from the adults in their life and from culture, the media that they absorb, which is everywhere. And so in order to insult a girl, maybe even as a way to flirt with her, they might do, slut shame her in a way that should put her down. It's also really interesting when boys and young men, as they get into high school and college, will slut shame girls that they have been sexually active with, or girls that they would like to be sexually active with. And that's really kind of, it's disgusting that we live in a culture where that is so common. And I think it's a really good place for parents to intervene, because it's so obviously, it's such an obvious logical inconsistency. So I would say, if you're an educator or a parent and you were to witness your son or his friends kind of making fun of a girl for being sexually active, especially if they are sexually active, and especially if they have been or are sexually active with this girl, that's a really good point of entry to ask them to question that logical inconsistency and just say, that's interesting. Why is her sexuality such a gross thing, or something that you're making fun of her for, where it's like pretty cool for you guys to be having sex? Why do you think that is? So it's just it's a good place to start a conversation.
Well, and I think your insights about deflection and from the sort of the guy's perspective, when I see this done, it was done as either the boy somehow or another was rejected, or their advances were no longer attractive or wanted or appropriate. And so basically, like the woman set up a boundary, but the guy didn't like it. And so it was some way of going and drawing attention to them, and it's inappropriate and it's hurtful and a whole range of other things. But sometimes it's actually, the woman standing up for herself, or the girl standing up for herself, but the girl's not giving credit for that. It's being twisted and turned around. And before you give your answer, Emily, I just want to remind folks that you're listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program with your guest hosts, myself, Stephen Kotev, and Abigail Clark. Today we're joined by Emily Lindin, and we're discussing the UnSlut Project, Stop Slut Shaming and Sexual Bullying. So go ahead, Emily. You can give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I just completely agree with you. It's true. Anytime a woman kind of implies that she wants to be sexual in a way that feels authentic to her, she's at risk of being labeled a slut. But it could be because she's not sexual in exactly the way that whatever her male suitor wants her to be, and that could be reason for being called a slut as well. So that's why I kind of always stress when I talk about slut shaming that there is literally no way to avoid being slut shamed when you're a girl or a woman. Often people's reaction is to say something like, well, if you don't want to be slut shamed, don't be a slut. And my reaction to that is always, what's a slut? Really? Define what a slut is. And that's a good way to start a conversation with students or kids as well. Just because slut means whatever the shamer wants it to mean. It could be, as you mentioned, someone who won't have sex with you anymore. So then they're a slut, or someone who is flirting with a guy that you kind of have a crush on, so then they're a slut, or is dressed a certain way that you wouldn't dress, so that makes them a slut. I mean, it's really in the eye of the beholder. And so there's no way for the target of that shaming to avoid being the target. And with that said, once you are the target of slut shaming, especially when you're a preteen or a teenage girl, it's not like other types of bullying where, for instance, if you're a child and you're being bullied for wearing glasses or for your religion or for being overweight or not having a typically attractive body shape or something like that, you can be pretty certain, especially now with how much bullying is on the minds of school administrators and parents everywhere, and it's a kind of hot topic of bullying, you can be pretty sure that if you went to an adult in your life and asked for help or confided in them of what you were going through, they would call it bullying. They would tell you it's not your fault. They would support you and help you kind of come up with ways to defend yourself or to deflect it or to cope with it. With sexual bullying, it's different. And that's why I'm focusing so specifically on it, not just because of my own experiences, but because a lot of adults don't see it as bullying. A lot of adults kind of join in. And so girls feel like, maybe if their parents have been stressing to them their whole lives that they are not to have sex before they're married, they're not to dress in a sexy way because that will invite attention that they don't want. If they have parents who have been enforcing these norms to them, when they're all of a sudden labeled a slut, they're not going to be able to turn to their parents for help because it's pretty likely that they're, in their minds at least, that their parents will go ahead and shame them for it as well. And a lot of school administrators kind of look the other way when it comes to sexual bullying because, they don't want to be seen as condoning sexual activity in preteens or teenagers. And the thing is, first of all, it's separate from any real sexual activity. You can be slut shamed just because of your perceived sexuality. And secondly, even if you are sexually active as a teenager or even a preteen, you don't need to be shamed for it. You need to be educated about what you're actually doing and the risks and how to be safe, and probably, if you're very young, why you definitely shouldn't be participating in sexual activity. But simply shaming someone and calling them a slut or implying that, they're dirty and disgusting and immoral is really counterintuitive, and often not counterintuitive, counterproductive, because a lot of targets of slut shaming then turn to really dangerous sexual behavior with the logic, especially as a teenager, before your brain has fully developed and you don't have adult perspective. The logic is, well, I'm already a slut, so what the heck? And that can be really dangerous for young women because unsafe sex, unwanted pregnancies, all the risks that come with not knowing how to have sex and being sexually active, we don't really want it to go there. So it's really important that when girls are being targeted, they have adults in their lives who can support them and give them the tools that they need.
What's really I find really interesting is what you said about kids not wanting to come to their parents and tell them about this because of how their parents have been raising them. And oftentimes, like you've already mentioned, sometimes people get called sluts and they've done nothing to deserve it. It's just someone doesn't like something that they did. So coming forward to your parents and saying something, I would imagine like a parent's natural reaction would be like, well, what did you do to get called that? And then that would make it even more difficult for a child to come forward and talk to her parents. And that just really resonated with me just because I thought I never even thought about it that way, that if, a lot of times parents don't understand the whole, like what exactly sexual bullying is, and that their child might not have done anything to deserve it, and people are still calling people sluts or saying whatever. And I think that's really interesting that you mentioned that, because that's really disheartening to think that a child wouldn't be able to come to their parents because they're afraid their parents are going to shame them. I think that's scary.
Yeah. It is. And it's, it's even worse that you use the word deserve. And I don't think anyone deserves to be slut shamed. I know you don't think that either, but this word it comes up in quite often. It's if you haven't done anything that might be considered, let's say, slutty or anything like that, you can still be labeled a slut. But even if you have, like, especially if you have, I would say, it can be even harder, because then you know that there is this kernel of truth, and you feel that, you are dirty and you do deserve this, and you do deserve all the bullying that you're getting. So that can really compound the shame for girls.
Well, and that's where I was hoping you could sort of take us next, Emily, is you started with some recommendations for interventions, for parents, for educators, don't let this slide. Make sure you talk about it. Do you have any other very specific practical tips that you could give to either, the individual who's experiencing the sexual bullying or the parent who may be listening or a friend to help them, better respond to this or deal with it?
Yes. One of the reasons that it can be so dangerous is because girls will take on this definition for themselves. So they define themselves as a slut because when we're young, we often let our peers kind of decide who and what we are and what's cool about us and what's icky about us. And we just take on other people's definitions of ourselves. So whether you're the target or whether you know someone who's the target, a good place to start is to encourage the girl to define herself as something other than a, quote, slut. So one way to do that is to focus on her talents or activities that she just really enjoys doing. For me, it was music and singing. I loved to sing. I always had. And so my parents enrolled me. I was also lucky to have parents who could afford to do this and who were motivated to do this, but they enrolled me in a choir and a music program that was outside of my toxic school environment. So that's a great, if you have the resources to do that, that's an awesome option. Even if you don't, you might have an activity like, painting or a sport that you really like doing, anything that you can do that gives you some kind of way to define yourself other than as others define you. So now I wasn't a slut, I was a pretty good singer, and I really liked to be on stage in front of people, and that kind of became how I defined myself instead of how everyone else was defining me. And that, because you can't control what people are going to say about your kid or what they're going to say about you, you kind of have to come up with ways to react to it in a youthful way instead of letting it sink in and, really harming that girl for decades in some cases.
Well, and it's interesting because it's so take it for granted, that if you've got someone who's a preteen or teen, that a lot of their identity is based off of what somebody else thinks about them, as opposed to letting them, sort of leaving them in that toxic environment as you portrayed it. You take that child and put them in a different environment that is going to be something that's positive for them in the sense of they like to do, that they're good at, and have them help build up their self-esteem and help them ride the storm out by doing that other activity. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, it helps them build self-esteem and it helps them define themselves as a good soccer player, let's say, or, someone who's getting pretty good at graphic design. But even if you can't take them out of school completely, which is not always the best solution, just having them go somewhere after school or on Saturdays or having an activity they can commit to is also, if it's not an option to completely take them out of the school, which nowadays doesn't always work because their reputation can follow them online.
And so, Emily, you have a documentary coming out. What made you decide to make a documentary, and what will we be seeing in the documentary?
Oh, yeah. So when I first was describing why I started this project, I mentioned Rehtaeh Parsons, who had been gang raped and subsequently slut-shamed for a year and a half as a rape victim and took her own life in 2013 when she was 17. And her story inspired the project in the first place. And then I decided to fly to Nova Scotia and interview her parents and her friends about what her experience was. And it's grown into this documentary film that is completely crowdfunded, which is really exciting. And it's not just Rehtaeh's story. It's actually 4 different women in addition to Rehtaeh's story, who we interviewed about their experiences being slut-shamed, including the minor victim in the Roman Polanski sex scandal back in 1977. Her name's Samantha Geimer. My story is part of the film as well. And right now, we finished it, and we're scheduling screenings, which is really exciting. Because the film was crowdfunded, we're crowdsourcing screenings as well, using a distributor called Tugg, T-U-G-G. And if listeners want to just go to unslutproject.com, you can find out all about the film. You can watch our trailer, which I'm really proud of. We just released it yesterday. And you can bring the film to your community center or your university or your town or a theater near you. I mean, you can bring the film to you, and we'll have a screening and even a discussion or follow-up Q&A afterwards. So that's the way that we're organizing screenings over the next few months. And I think it's going to be great for community-based screenings because people will be able to kind of come up with real, useful, specific solutions so that it's not just kind of a general conversation we're having, but one that can be specific to that school or that town. And members of the community can be part of the conversation after all having watched the film together. So I would really encourage people to do that, to check out the film's trailer and to get in touch with me through the website at unslutproject.com, and we can make it happen.
Awesome. And that was the natural segue too, because we're going to get specifically into how to find you, and we're going to ask you to list all those addresses and URLs again. But what would you have as a call to action for our listeners today? Say they're very inspired, they want to learn more, they want to do something, they want to engage further with what you've taught us today. What's your recommendation for them?
There are a few different ways to get involved. The best place to start is at our website, which is unslutproject.com. And like I said, we're scheduling screenings. So it's really easy and really, I think, a great opportunity to bring the film to your area. That's doable through the website. We sell shirts that say Define Slut, and those are fantastic conversation starters. And we always encourage people who have those shirts to post them on social media. And that's another way to kind of get involved and also support the project because it's a nonprofit. So buying a shirt is like making a donation, which you can also do on the website. We also have a donation page. If you have survived slut shaming, or if you know someone who has, or this kind of rings a bell for you and you're thinking, oh man, that reminds me of something I went through, we encourage you to share your story. That's what the main thrust of the project is, these personal stories that are all collected on our website and provide hope and perspective to girls who read them. So that's another great way to get involved. We're also on social media, and a lot of people who kind of will use the hashtag unslut to join the conversation and spread the word. So that's another great way to. We're on Twitter at UnSlut Project, and we use the hashtag unslut. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/UnSlut Project. And I just got on Instagram, Emily Lindin, Lindin, on Instagram, but I don't have that many followers yet. I think I have like 100 or something. I just started and I'm getting used to the platform, so don't make fun of my Instagram account. But other than that, Twitter, Facebook, that's mostly where the UnSlut Project lives on social media.
And
go ahead, Abigail. Go ahead.
Sorry. And I was just going to ask, so you said, I just want to clarify, so you said UnSlut Project, and then you said your Twitter handle was at UnSlut Project, and then they can hashtag unslut too.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
No, you've done a really great job of giving us an overview of what sexual bullying looks like, some of the dynamics inside it, a way of helping first acknowledge and then provide some sort of coping mechanisms for folks. So thank you so much for that. What would be your final thoughts for our listeners tonight, Emily?
I would say to not be afraid to start with yourself. When I was 27 and started this project, I thought I was pretty progressive when it came to thinking about female sexuality. But I wasn't. And a lot of introspection made me realize, I participated in slut shaming to some extent. So to start with yourself and your own assumptions, your own biases, and the way you might react to girls who bring up slut shaming or stories you see in the media, and to use your own experiences and the things that you witness in your life as a starting point to then bring it outward into your family and your community. And I think that's the best way to make large-scale cultural change.
Well, thank you so much for being on the program. Abigail, do you want to add anything else?
I just thank you for being a part of the program. This is an awesome thing that you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Abigail.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you enjoyed the program. You can find all of our podcasts archived to listen at your convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. You can also become a Facebook fan of Conflict Connections or Twitter me at TXConflictCoach.
Can you guys hear anything?